Thank you for clicking. This is not another MMORPG is dying video. I wouldn't be silly enough to make an MMORPGs are dying video in the same quarter as Josh Drive Hayes. Sorry, Sawman. In fact, this is actually going to be the opposite of that. This is a what is the future of MMOs video. You know, the kind of video that I am hopelessly optimistic about and will ultimately feel like shit about within a month because it all, you know, everything just takes a turn for the worse. That kind of video. But basically, what's the future of the MMO genre going to be like in the next 10 years? Well, believe it or not, I have no fucking clue. I'm not a mind reader. I don't have any powers to see the future, and I'm not especially bright or smart either in general. I'm just here to entertain. But I do have some theories about where it could be going after looking at the genre, not just now, but over the last couple decades and being hopelessly and needlessly addicted to this genre forever, really since I was a tiny kid. But will we have a return to form of innovation with a genrefication of MMOs like what existed pre-World of Warcraft? Will MMO players instead further consolidate into mega MMOs like World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV? Or will the genre just kind of die or be something completely different? Let's talk about a couple of ways that I can see the MMOs going in the next couple of years. But before we get into what's gonna happen, we need to talk about what has happened and kind of set the stage a little bit. If you ask anyone, the MMO genre has been on the decline or dying for decades or years, which is honestly a really long death rattle for a genre when you think about it. And we could spend this entire video arguing about that, whether it's dying or not dying. But instead, we're just going to concede two important points right off the bat and get right through it. The internet has changed dramatically since 1997 to 2008-ish, when things started to kind of go down. There's infinitely more ways to communicate and play games with friends, allowing for more micro interactions. And there's more games to do so that were not really there. More lobby-based games, more multiplayer games, more co-op games. You find your friends more often than not in Discord and not in an MMO. The second thing is that there's seemingly less money going into MMOs than in previous decades, largely due to years upon years of MMOs failing to gain traction. And this could probably be said for gaming in general as we go forward, but I think it's especially the case with MMOs, especially over the last couple of years. Because you see, MMOs are very, very high risk, but they're also very high reward. Now that we've conceded those points, what is the very first way that I think the genre could go? Well, it's not going to make you happy, or me, probably not. It's probably going to upset everybody. So let's get it out of the way early. One of the first ways that I see the genre going in the future is the mini MMO or the offshoot MMO. Take, for example, a game like Enshrouded, or more recently, a game like Fellowship. One of the things I've been seeing more in the past few years is the growth of essentially this mini MMO or this offshoot type game. Games that play a lot like MMOs or even utilize multiplayer or large scale, but couldn't really be confused with MMOs. The kind of games that still hit some of those itches that we have to play MMOs, but don't give you the full feature, the full picture of it. The most obvious recent addition to this trend is Fellowship, the game that takes the dungeon running of the genre, puts it in a lobby where you have gear progression, mounts, cosmetics, and even looks like World of Warcraft. And it does all of this essentially as basically a lobby-based dungeon runner, they're kind of like a Mythic Plus simulator, with a little touch of hero-based MMO, kind of like, I guess, what you would consider a League of Legends impact. Right down to the add-ons that exist in World of Warcraft in this. But don't get me wrong, this is not a new or even novel concept. This has been done before, and it's been done successfully before. Have you ever heard of a game called Vindictus, which launched in 2010? It's essentially Fellowship. It is a dungeon runner game with a lobby, with an auction house, with all those things in it. And it's also a hero-based dungeon runner. This is the kind of game that's taking a section of the MMO that is one of the more beloved parts of the MMO, not necessarily for me, but for many, many people, that thrill of the dungeon, the competitiveness of PvE dungeons, and taking that and packaging it in a way that can appeal to someone who doesn't have the time to play games more, or they want to play more games. Because one of the biggest things with MMOs, one of the things that kind of makes it difficult, and also I believe lends itself to some of this tribalism we have with the MMORPG genre, where we think our game is the best game and their game is dog shit, tends to be the amount of time they request of you. To really feel part of the world of an MMO, you have to devote a lot of time to it, a lot more than, say, a single player game that you're going to play every now and then and finish the story and then be done with it, or a lobby-based game that maybe you'll just play a little bit. So these are just giving like little bite-sized versions of that, little bite-sized versions that will not taste as good as the full meal. They're not even trying to taste as good as the full meal, but they're trying to give at least some semblance of that little bit of a meal. But there's more to that, and I think potentially the type of game that may actually have greater legs in the genre than these shorter versions. Survival craft games have always been a kind of MMO adjacent, especially for the more sandboxy MMOs. From Rust to Conan Exiles to more recently Enshrouded, you take very similar gameplay loops to MMOs, but you shrink down the size of the game and you make it more linear. You get rid of the persistence and usually make players host their own servers, putting that cost onto them. Enshrouded even has essentially group or raid bosses along with their ongoing RPG. These are the games that kind of give you that RPG experience, but then also bring in this whole social connection of creating bases with each other, grouping up together, taking on challenges together, and doing things on a niche social level. You know, basically between like 4 players to 50 players, or I mean, with Rust, hundreds of players. And it kind of takes that and just shrinks it down into this smaller little box where the game kind of has an end point, but that end point may still be thousands of hours. It's kind of essentially the MMO that you host with your own little parameters around it. I use Enshrouded as an example here specifically because if you took Enshrouded and you expanded it and made it a persistent world, it has the basic components that make most MMOs. You have basically solo grinding, you have group grinding, you have combat, you have RPG progression, you have skill progression, you have leveling up, you basically have all the vertical progression, all of the dungeon, like diving into dungeons and things that you would expect in an MMO, just in a nice little neat MMO light package, a shared world package. And there's tons of other examples like this where the main differentiating factor tends to be the persistence and the server sizes. If PAX Day made you host your own server, for example, you'd probably actually put it in this subgenre. What makes this so interesting to me, in general, this little section about these offshoots of MMOs, is that they have the potential to grow into their own kind of genre, the way that a little mod on Warcraft 3 became one of the biggest gaming genres, and also probably the biggest graveyard for failed games other than maybe battle royales in gaming history. Survival crafts and shared world RPGs are kind of just now scratching the surface of what they're capable of. And if they start incorporating more of those things that MMO players love, like more social features, more vertical progression, RPG progression, leveling, and even, maybe taking some cues from ARPGs and stuff like that, where you have Diablo, which is kind of just this shared world, but not really, with lots of phasing. And it'll be interesting to see in the next couple of years, how does this genre grow? Does it get too inundated with too many games? Because there are a lot of them in it. And then in the side of Fellowship, is there anything they can be able to do? Anything that taking parts of the MMO and putting it in its own little package, an easy to access package, is that gonna be appealing enough to make people play it? If you asked me about these mini MMOs or these offshoots in 2008, I honestly would have said, you're fucking crazy. Because I wouldn't have thought that anyone would want those types of games. I wouldn't have thought they'd want, especially a game like Fellowship. Except that that game, Vindictus, which launched in 2010, well...
Why do we exist?
It's now lasted 15 years with continued updates, adding their 26th hero class just this past year in 2024. I'm also not entirely convinced that Project Ghost, the upcoming MMO from the World of Warcraft creator Greg Street, is not something like this. It kind of sounds a little bit lobby-based, but just like larger lobbies and more players. So it kind of could be that next step. Same with another game like Dune Awakening, where I'm also not sure how much like these type of games it'll be compared to the MMOs that we kind of know, the persistent world MMOs with thousands of player type MMOs. But you may be sitting there saying, Redbeard, without the persistence, without the world lore, without all the things that make an MMO feel like an MMO, it's crap and it's not the things that I want. And to that, I would say, yeah, I kind of agree. It's not that I don't like those types of games, although I did try Fellowship and found very quickly it wasn't for me. But it's more that I don't think it's easy to replicate the feelings of MMOs in these ways. And that's why one of the other things that I've potentially see happening is something I've been calling for a couple years now, the genrefication of the MMO, which funnily enough is kind of like going back to pre-2004. One of the best things to happen to MMOs was the explosion of popularity that came with World of Warcraft in 2004. It brought in tons of new money, tons of new players, and it catapulted the genre from niche to, well, less niche. It was also one of the absolute worst things to happen to the MMO genre, because when a game was that exponentially more successful than its nearest competitor, everyone saw dollar signs and decided the only good MMO was that. And that everything else they'd been trying for the last, I don't know, half decade or so was bullshit and we shouldn't try that anymore. And that, I believe, started the decline, essentially, of the genre, because there's no more innovation. It was just trying to replicate, and replicating in a shittier way. Warhammer Online in 2008 added public quests and RVR lakes, but relied on WoW's class and quest formula. Age of Conan showed some boobs and included decapitation alongside directional combat, but it too used the same quest hub formula, and on MMOs continued to copy and what had already been done, and shockingly trying to do what one game 4 years before had done, but not managing to do it better because that game had an 8-year head start. That just meant, in general, your product was going to be a subpar product. Yeah, you had so much time to try and catch up on. And it's not like technology had advanced that much in that time period from when World of Warcraft launched. But that's why I talk about this golden age of MMOs. And I know it's cliche to call this the golden age of MMOs, and it just so happens to be when I started playing MMOs. But what I'm referring to it that way, what I'm talking about specifically, is innovation and choice. Basically, the choice to find the MMO that you personally liked playing. Not every MMO feeling like the same type of MMO. From 1997 to 2003, MMOs tried all sorts of new things, playing within a small sandbox and trying to figure out what would stick to the wall. Ultima Online wasn't the first MMO, but it crashed the scene and supercharged it in 1997 as a PvP and PvE MMO that had tons of sandbox features and used a skill system for player progression, allowing tons of customization. A game where there were limits on how many skills you could pick, but not on what skills you could combine together to kind of create your own class. It was largely a solo MMO that had a social world of interconnected requirements tied behind commerce, and it managed to hit over 100,000 players, which was unheard of at the time. EverQuest followed up by condensing the nascent MMO space into a D&D formula of dungeons, exploration, and direct linear leveling with class interdependencies. No longer were you just going and creating your own class with 7 different skills and maximizing them. You were finding classes that worked well together, pre-made classes that were balanced around each other. It took Ultima Online's top-down human-only gameplay and it expanded into a world of rich, incredible lore, tons of playable races, a fully 3D world complete with dragons, orcs, and halflings, and it added intense group play and dangerous raids, leaning away from PvP and into cooperative but competitive PvE. But the innovation didn't stop there. Shadowbane took UO's PvP approach after it had abandoned it and added in player cities, made it 3D, took EverQuest's multiple races, and gave them unique abilities, like flight or run speed boosts. It took customization to the next level by giving your base class the ability to mix and match disciplines dropped from PvE enemies, like the Were-Rat or the Were-Bear or the Thief on top of your other class. Star Wars Galaxies then went and asked, what if we treated crafting like a job, where you had to survey for minerals and set up entire planets worth of mining equipment in your guild city? And at the same time included a galaxy-wide PvP battle system, player homes, non-combat progression, and player roles, and also used a system more like Ultima Online's classless skill system to craft your own class by choosing individual skill trees to level up. Things you leveled up by doing those things. Dark Age of Camelot brought us 3-realm PvP, finding balance in opposing forces. RuneScape utilized similar skill systems to Ultima Online, but not only greatly expanded on them. It didn't limit them to 7 skills per character and offered all of that through a browser. It goes on and on from there. EVE Online, Lineage 2, Ragnarok Online, Final Fantasy XI, Asheron's Call, City of Heroes. What all these games had in common was that they were all approaching the genre with a unique bend because there wasn't a single dominant force. The most dominant was probably EverQuest with just shy of about 500,000 players, and Lineage 2, which had potentially millions but didn't have much of a hold in the West. The difference in players was smaller. MMOs could try to experiment. The genre was young, it was untested, and it was undeniably janky. Every MMO from that era has issues, design flaws, bugs, lack of polish, graphics, and user interfaces that would age poorly, and many of them are built on code that is incredibly difficult to fix at this stage, even though many of them are still going today. But all of it was basically a beautiful time because you had distinct choices. You could find an MMO that appealed to a different type of playstyle by just looking at the genre's list of the games that were available. And it's actually kind of what I foresee potentially happening again. But the important thing with that, this important thing of having a genrefication of MMOs, is that comes with some negatives. It comes with more jank, less polish, because there's less money behind it, because those games are not aiming at World of Warcraft and their millions of players, or Final Fantasy XIV. They're aiming at thousands, tens of thousands of players. Mortal Online 2 is a very good example of this, a game that is not breaking any population records, but a game that is fitting their little niche of this hardcore PvP MMO. This game where it's this first person, really gritty and with directional combat. It has its niche that it wants to fit, and it's fitting it for those players. That's why I say that there's signs of this happening. Games like Palia, the cozy MMO, Star's Reach, which is using arcade combat and terraforming, Pantheon and Monsters and Memories, which are trying to be these classically inspired MMOs, Ashes of Creation with their PvX system, Eternal Tombs, of course, Mortal Online 2, Brighter Shores, which is the most casual MMO you can ever play. And so many others are trying new things or revamping old things. Even some older games like Albion Online, a formerly independent Kickstarter MMO, have found solid footing in a market still dominated by World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. The question will always be with these though is, are these sustainable? What kind of population do they need to stick around? And perhaps most importantly, how long must an MMO be around for it to be viable? And that last question is probably a big enough topic for another video way down the line. But there's one final way that I think MMOs could go. And it's kind of the way that is most likely, in all honesty, the most likely way for things to go. And it is the reason why, to me, when people say the MMO genre is dead, it can't be. It can't be because there are MMOs now huge MMOs that are bigger than really anything we ever could have imagined, even in 2004, 2005, 2006. World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV are just gigantic MMOs. Old school RuneScape has somehow defied gravity and become a larger MMO now than it used to be. So that's why I think there's a very strong possibility that things will kind of just stay the same. And maybe this one's worse than hearing the first one about the mini MMOs. Because staying the same, staying stagnant as this is why so many people come to channels like this one. So I'm sorry. But yes, I do think there is a very real possibility that MMOs just stay the same. These mega MMOs have a few things in common. They're massive war chests, occasional bad PR due to hyper greedy moves like $30 sub options and $90 auction house mounts, continued massive player bases, and the ability to weather population drops through solo viable play and server infrastructure for group-related activities that links together their network of servers, making the games at times feel like more of a mega server than smaller servers that more acutely feel population drops. These major MMOs have such a stranglehold on the genre that the people interested in it kind of just stick to these games, with a few MMO refugees branching out to others. Games like Lord of the Rings Online, Guild Wars 2, ESO, EverQuest, and half a dozen others all have sustainable populations until their parent companies get too greedy at least. These massive MMOs, mainly the two gigantic ones, Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft, with honorable mention to RuneScape, they kind of gobble up most of the current MMO player base. These games have weathered new releases like New World and Throne and Liberty that are flash in the pan MMOs that get big launches and then completely crash to earth within a month or so, especially around major expansions for the big MMOs. There really isn't any reason why these massive games can't just keep going. It's also why the genre will continue to be attractive to the less risk-averse companies, because it has shown to be completely evergreen. These games make a shit ton of money if they can find that dedicated population. I don't see these games losing their established populations anytime soon, and even some bad PR and aggressive monetizations seem to rarely dent their momentum. For every World of Warcraft is dying video, there's another singing the praises of the latest patch, or several singing the praises of its latest patch. It's been said over and over and over again for years, but the only WoW killer is WoW itself. And I think that's gonna stay true. But there's one way I don't think the MMO genre is gonna go. And I'll be quick with this one because it's kind of negative. I don't think we're going to ever go back to the point where there is the rush to make MMOs that there was in about 2006 to 2008, when it felt like an MMO was launching every couple months, and they're launching from well-established companies like Electronic Arts and so on. I don't think that that's something we will get back, just because there has been such a change to the genre. Not entirely because of the genre. The world itself has changed in so many ways, with, generally more ability to do the things that MMOs offered outside of MMOs. I think that's always going to have a dampening effect on the MMO genre from now for the next 10 years, 20 years, on and on. And there's good reason for that. I mean, the gaming industry itself has grown at a exponential rates. It is basically a ton of new money has moved into the gaming space over the years, with really basically people just going in trying to make as much money as they can without a whole lot of care or concern for what the games are actually making. And because of the nature of MMOs and how much upfront cost there is and how much time it generally takes to make an MMO versus a smaller game. And for a while it was the rise of the mobile game, although that's kind of coming a little bit crashing down to earth the last couple of years. But really, there's so many other ways in the gaming space to make money that I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of investment in MMOs in general. At this point, I'm getting too long-winded. I've had to take several breaks to get some water because my throat is getting dry in this video. So I'm just gonna leave you with this. I do not think the MMO genre is gonna die in the next 10 years. I do think we're gonna continue to see changes, and I do think and hope we will continue to see a shift towards more genrefication of MMOs. I think on the side, you're going to have more games trying to kind of pick at the sides of the MMO population, the players that love MMOs, the players that are more susceptible to, I want to go play this game for a set amount of time and then leave. And they're not trying to live in a world. Those players are going to find a lot of homes in games like Enshrouded and games like Fellowship. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I don't necessarily think that that's going to be necessarily something that hurts the MMO genre in the long run. I just think that we're going to continue to see shifts in the genre, but at the same time, World of Warcraft's not going anywhere. Final Fantasy XIV is not going anywhere. Those games, even if they have an occasional shitty expansion, they're going nowhere. Those games are so entrenched. They have such large fanatical populations. They're going absolutely nowhere. And I think in 10 years from now, and we come back to this video, if it's 10 years from now, if it's 2035, I would honestly be surprised if in 2035, World of Warcraft no longer existed, or Final Fantasy XIV no longer existed. Or everything I said is absolute total bullshit, and maybe you should tell me down in the comment section what you think is going to happen to the MMO genre over the next couple of years. Thank you so much for watching this long as hell video. I appreciate it. I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.